Hey, Rishi.
Hey Adam, good to be back with you for another episode. We got a lot to talk about tonight. How you been?
I was just thinking I really need another Zoom thing to be on. So glad we're here tonight. No, but seriously, this is actually the type of conversation we're doing here that I really do need, and hopefully a lot of people tonight. It's a lot of crazy political developments every day. Coupling that with trying to homeschool and all those things. All I could say is my kid's getting really good at video games. But tonight we have some guests who are going to help us sort everything out. So let's get started. All right. So welcome to the fifth episode of This Is Not a Drill, live on Organizing Upgrade. Thanks as always to Real News Network for your amazing tech skills, video production of this show. Tonight, Rishi and I are going to again talk with some leading left strategists about what organizers should be investing in this post-Bernie, post-Warren electoral cycle. November's election does still loom large on the horizon, and it's clear many of Trump's machinations every day are keeping that in mind. But it is still kind of hard to make sense of the strategies that the left and the right are doing in this moment in the middle of a pandemic. Country has the worst outbreak of coronavirus in the world. And the debate is about when to open up, when not to open up. And it seems like it's become more of a political debate than a health or safety debate, unfortunately. Today was actually a day of mourning. A lot of progressive groups recognized and were protesting, delivering body bags to the White House in DC, reading the names of those who've been lost, who've perished during the pandemic. So that happened. For the left, we're not entirely united on what to be demanding for the government to do right now. And it also seems like we're not 100% ready to get behind Biden as a uniting figure in this election, even though we're generally 100% ready to fight to defeat Trump. So that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about this evening. We're hoping our guests today can cut through some of the noise and point us toward the prize that we have to keep our eyes on as each of them see it.
So before we introduce our guests, we are really excited to announce that our next episode is going to be a special exclusive episode with at least two senior staffers from the Bernie Sanders campaign, Claire Sandberg and Becca Rast. We're going to talk with both of them to debrief the Sanders campaign, get to the lessons that are the most important for organizers to take away from that entire experience. And we also hope to talk about the future of the Sanders movement with them. That exclusive episode is going to be on June 10th at 8 p.m. Mark your calendars. That episode is definitely going to be one you don't want to miss. Luckily, we also have an amazing group of guests tonight, all of whom are strategists, candidates, and organizers serving our movements. We have Jessica Cisneros, an inspiring activist and former U.S. congressional candidate from Texas. We have Ense Ufot, the executive director of the New Georgia Project, fighting on the front lines in that state. We have Robert Peters, Illinois state senator and former organizer, now representing Barack Obama's old state Senate district. And we have Harmony Goldberg, longtime movement educator and currently the director of praxis at the Grassroots Policy Project. We want to remind our guests to not wait for us to ask a question directly to them. Just jump in with your views to weigh in on the conversation. Without any further delays, let's dive in. So Ense, I want to come to you first. In yesterday's New York Times, you argued about the need to invest in Black communities and Black voters in this election and the struggle against racist voter suppression efforts around the country. You had a number of very concrete tactical proposals. Like a lot of organizers, we were inspired by the list of demands and tactics in that document and wondered what organizers working in hostile conditions can do to try to win those reforms. Now, you're in Georgia in a political climate that, at least by some measure, is quite hostile to expanding voting rights. And you and your organization have a history of going against the GOP-led assault against Black communities and against voting rights. Can you tell us what that fight has looked like in Georgia, and what lessons people working in other states can take from your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So we launched the New Georgia Project in 2014. And the first year, we had these massive voter registration drives. And well, let me take a step back for context. So Georgia is changing very, very rapidly. It is likely to be the first state in the deep South to have a white minority, to be majority people of color. And while, you know, folks in my organization are super excited about that, we're also very clear that demographics don't equal destiny. And so when we began to sort of survey the landscape and think about what will it take to bring sort of big structural change to Georgia, we started looking at the number of people that vote. And at the time, there were 1.2 million people of color, African Americans mostly, but Latinos and Asian Americans who were eligible to vote and unregistered. And so we got to work. And so in year one, we registered 86,419 people to vote. And by the voter registration deadline, only 46,000 of those folks have made it on the voter rolls. And so we approached the Secretary of State, Brian Kemp, who is now our asterisk governor, and said, hey, where are those 40,000 missing voters? And his reply was to open an investigation into the New Georgia Project and an investigation into our organizers. We went to court, we lost. And we lost because there's no law in Georgia that requires counties or the Secretary of State to process voter registration forms on a particular timeline. So I would say 6 to 9 months after the election that we registered people for, those 40,000 people started to get added to the voter rolls. And that is sort of an exemplar of what we have faced in our push to bring about a better Georgia. Because they have a trifecta, a governing trifecta. They are constantly sort of using the police powers in their investigation to suppress votes. And it is, annoying, it's scary, it's frustrating, but we are making progress and we are on the verge of winning. We're on the verge of flipping the state. I compare it to somebody that's about to get fired. When you know that you're about to get fired and they start behaving really poorly and acting out, stealing office supplies, that's what we're watching right now in Georgia. That's what we're living through in many places across the South. And yeah, I think that there's a long and recent history of voter suppression in Georgia. It is why the minimum wage in Georgia is $5.15 an hour. It is why in a place like Albany, Georgia, which is one of the state's sort of COVID hotspots, that there's one hospital to serve hundreds of thousands of people. It's why we don't have Medicaid expansion, despite the fact that all of our polling says that Georgians overwhelmingly want this. And so, yeah, I lay out a prescription for how we try to or how we go about putting the nail in Jim Crow's coffin for good. And that includes one sort of radical honesty about what is happening. It's no secret to anyone that Stacey Abrams, who also happens to be the founder of the New Georgia Project, was the gubernatorial candidate in 2018. And the entire world watched an election be stolen. And we have not contended with that. Many of the sort of tactics that were used to suppress votes, like exact match, which basically says that if your information doesn't 100% match what's in the DMV database, that you'll be kicked off the voter rolls. So for someone whose name is Michael and it's spelled with an AE, and whoever was doing the data entry inverts the letters and it's EA, that person doesn't exactly match the information that's in the DMV database, and they won't be added to the voter rolls. We didn't even know that that was a law, that that was a policy, because it had never been publicized. And so as we continue to work to build power at the ballot box, but also in the state legislature, again, we expect resistance. And so as we prepare the communities that we organize with, as we prepare our organizers, we know that there aren't going to be any easy victories. But I'm very, very, very excited about the future. We're concerned about the moment that we're in. 80% of the people in the state who've been hospitalized from COVID-19 are African American. 50% of the people who've died are Black, even though Black folks only make up 33% of the folks in the state. And so it is not hyperbole when we say that we are really literally voting for our lives. And so, yeah, that is in some what the New York Times piece was about yesterday. So a diagnosis of the problems and that we face in sort of maintaining a robust democracy, and the solutions that we see are working and that we want other folks to adopt across the nation.
Thanks, and I encourage everyone to definitely read that. And I also want to ask Jessica, you ran for Congress in another red state, or as I think many of y'all like to say, a non-voting state that wouldn't be red if everybody voted, but in another pretty hostile terrain. But you ran as a strong progressive. One of the things we talk about on the show a lot is, kind of struggle within the Democratic Party and progressives. Seems like if you would have been elected, you probably would have joined the squad based on your, kind of politics and policies and platform. Hopefully you still will. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about kind of what you learned from running in a red state and kind of how you would like to transform the Democratic Party if you are able to get elected in the future.
Yeah, and right now, it seems like there's so many parallels with Texas and like the situation in Georgia. I was like nodding my head because it's like there's so many things that are very similar down here. And I think for the biggest lesson, I guess, that we got from our efforts in this past election cycle was that, yeah, there are a lot of people that are so disengaged from the electoral process because we feel like we aren't being engaged, right? There were so many people that came out to vote from very rural areas of our district. And just for some people that aren't quite familiar with Texas 28, it's right on the border with Mexico. It's a very big district. It's roughly the size of the state of New Jersey. So there was a lot of ground to cover, a lot of communities to cover. And even though I, was born and raised in this district, I'm from Laredo, and there are many other areas that are very different from Laredo. But we made it a point to go out there and ask people to get involved. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've had such a successful campaign, because we understood, my team was mostly composed of people from the district. We knew our communities, and we also knew that our communities weren't asked to be involved. And I think recently, as I've been reflecting a lot on the campaign, even like on Mother's Day, I was looking for pictures of like moms that like helped out in our campaign, and there were a lot, right? And grassroots looks differently. I think we need to assess in terms of like what our contribution is in this movement. And I think we learned a lot in this last election cycle of what that could look like. But I think for us and like moving forward, the reason why we were so successful is because we're a bridge for that disconnect between those communities and like what's happening at the national level in terms of politics. And that's something that I hope to continue to do if, one day I do if I end up running again and I get elected, that's a lot of the work that we're going to keep on doing, is engaging those folks that for so long have been forgotten and left out of the process.
Thanks, Jessica. And, so folks know, Jessica ran against Cuellar, who is hopefully in his last term now, but, one of the most right conservative Democrats out there in the country. So it was an exciting race and a very close race. And thanks for sharing that, and also for the rest of the show, some of your lessons.
Of course. And I just want to point out that, again, being from a red state, we're expected to be very conservative. And that's a myth that my opponent kept perpetuating since he wasn't elected to office, but also during the election, during the race. And the fact that we're able to hold him to 51.8% of the vote is incredible, because that means that almost half of the people that voted, and given the fact that we're facing name ID as one of the biggest hurdles in the campaign, that we had all these people come out and vote and, say that they're ready for change in our district, and that we're pushing the needle, and that we wanted progressive representation. I think for a 26-year-old candidate running for the first time, it was a pretty powerful statement on behalf of the people in our district.
That's amazing, Jessica. Yeah, and I think your answers really point to the fact that for a long time, this whole idea of red state, blue state just completely hides all of the real tensions that sort of underlie society underneath that. Real fights between leftists and folks on the left, folks on the right, folks in the middle. Real class struggle, real struggle, real sort of racial struggle for racial justice underneath. So that's a really important point. And Robert, I want to bring you in. As you come from an organizing background, and in the short while that you've been in office, you've spearheaded a number of left progressive bills, none perhaps more significant than the rent and mortgage moratorium that you've authored, that's currently under consideration. So from the perspective of a movement legislator, what is it that organizers and grassroots groups should understand about winning ambitious legislation in this period and building support within and beyond Democratic Party legislators?
Well, that's a huge question. And I think it's a bit experimental right now. But I think people need to, there's a few things. I think you have to be one part bold in your ask. Another part is when you become a legislator, and it's important that you don't leave that space, that you stay grounded in the movement, that you stay active in the movement, and that you see yourself grow in the movement. And part of that is to bring that movement down, in my case, to Springfield, to the Capitol, and seeing it as an important piece to passing legislation. So I think for me, I think last year I passed 13 bills, and almost every bill involved some community organization doing the work, some who have a longer history of doing that work, some who are newer to doing that work. And the folks who are newer to doing that work in the Capitol, being open to learning the process of passing legislation. I think it's one of the toughest things is transitioning from movement organizing to governing. And I think it can be like a burst of the bubble. And it can be a bit shocking. So when I first got down here, I think the first month I felt so lost. I felt very alone. And it took a lot of people to sort of agitate me out of an imposter syndrome, and to keep doing that, to tell me that they have my back, and for me to commit to having their back. And it was it can be a bit shock. It's a shock to the system. I think about it as in, like, this is our moment once we get into governing, but we have to be very open to governing and seeing it as being part of a longer term plan to win power. And so I often think about how the right did this in the 80s, especially when they started getting governing power, and how that is 35, 40 years ago. But it was a long-term plan, and that each thing that I'm working on and each thing that every organization's working on isn't to completely win the movement with the snap of the finger, but to know that it's setting up the foundations for long-term structural change, and that I have to be, and I think people I organize with have to be patient with that. And one of the key things is helping move people to understand organizing does work within the Capitol. And, to get really deep into this, sometimes I prefer to move things without any attention. So there was a pipeline protest bill that I'll use as an example. It was an ALEC bill that was designed to basically criminalize any, in the Dakota Access Pipeline, essentially. And for about 2-3 months, I just got intel, reported back to organizations on the ground on who they need to talk to, who they need to target. And I organized people within committee and tried to basically do an inside-outside strategy, which led to us being able to kill a bill. And I remember when I first killed the bill, and the sponsor basically asked me, did it feel good to kill a bill? And they said in a very respectful way, that something usually a freshman doesn't do, but it was an example of my job of organizing on the inside, the organizing on the outside, and for a good chunk of it, nobody knowing that I'm doing this work. And I rarely try to talk about this. I'm talking about it now because if you start being seen as someone who can kill a bill, you become a target for people who want to pass those bad bills. So I always say there's some part where I need to be very public about the work I'm doing, and another part in which I need to operate pretty quietly. And sometimes it's not even me carrying the bill. Maybe it's someone else has to carry the bill and I'm supporting them. But it's really about the long-term movement organizing and long-term movement politics and long-term movement governing. And it's not necessarily about my name being on a piece of legislation or being in a press release. It's really about setting up the conditions for us to have more power.
Thank you for that story. And in ways, it's like one of the things that kind of drives me crazy is that we know that this kind of slow and steady organizing and kind of power building in the states really works. Like you mentioned, the right did it. We're doing it to a lot of success more recently in some states. On the other hand, there's these massive crises. So I want to bring in Harmony, our last guest tonight, about the crises and kind of any opportunities coming out of that, where it feels like all of a sudden we have to react more quickly, or maybe there's a big opportunity that we can't just move slow or something like that. So you wrote recently in Organizing Upgrade actually about some of the kind of overlapping, intersected crises, health, political, economic, and some of the opportunities that might present for folks like us on this call to move forward more quickly than we might otherwise. At the same time, some are saying there's a crisis in the Democratic Party, like this kind of impasse between the progressives and the centrists. Maybe you could just speak to what you think some of the opportunities are for us to build on the organizing we're already doing in the moment that we face.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think something that we've all seen in the past period is ideas that would have seemed incredibly radical, unthinkable, unimaginable are suddenly in the real public debate, right? And that's really a huge opening for us. That the idea that we could cancel rent, the idea that the government should provide a baseline of support to working families on a monthly basis is a normal part of the conversation. Now, that's an opportunity to advance our demands, and there's also a huge opportunity to shift the terms of the debate in our society at this point. I think what we've seen in the last month that's incredibly humbling is the absence of our power to actually systematically move that agenda at a federal level. So on the one hand, there's a huge opening for the Democrats to step in and actually speak to the real lived experiences of working people who know in our bones, right, that we shouldn't have to pay rent if we can't work because of this pandemic, right? Who see the corporate bailouts happening and not bailouts to working families. There's a huge opening to actually shift the conversation. And I think, unfortunately, what we saw with this last round of legislation, there are some important things included in there, but what was supposed to be a messaging bill is only a partial solution, right? Is only half the deal that should have been put forward, given that it's going to get decimated in the Senate. So I think that there's opportunities on a broad level, but we actually don't have the power yet to consolidate those into direct legislative victories or even into like the direct federal, the legislation that's passing in the House. And so the opportunity we have is actually to step into this moment of crisis with some real analytic clarity about the timeline it's going to take to move to victory on a federal level in particular, right? And so I think if we have to be frank that we don't have the power yet at the federal level to get even the House to pass the legislation that we need. And so we need to start creating local groundswells to shift the terms of the debate, right? We do need at a federal level more consolidation, more clarity, more coordination among progressive legislators and among social movements to actually have some focus to pass some of the core demands, whether we want to call it paycheck guarantee, rent cancellation, right? So focus on a few things that we can actually push through. But what we have the chance to do now is to create groundswells to shift the debate at the federal level so that we actually can show that the Democratic Party is the party of working people, and that hopefully will help us shift the election so that we can actually start to consolidate some of these victories in 2021 and beyond, right? Because the crisis does open up real opportunities, but it only opens up opportunities if we build and consolidate the power to actually win those victories.
Anyone want to jump in on that or have reflections on that kind of proposals?
I'll just say, from a perspective of being in governing and both organizing, it's just we are in a dual crisis, and there's a real unique opportunity for us to, how do you, I'm not supposed to say take advantage, but it goes back to it being a moment to just start pushing really bold policy proposals that are tied to movement organizing, but also the fact that realizing that the people who do have power, and I should be quieter right now, don't really have an idea of what to do to deal with this crisis, which can make for strange bedfellows, and it can move people. And, I don't know as much on the federal level, but I do think about the fact that Kamala Harris and Bernie Sanders both proposed, a piece of legislation that would give folks $2,000 a month, which is just, we still have a long way to go, but I think it just shows how you can create these sort of strange bedfellows that end up becoming more people can see how they are tied together in this crisis. And I think they're movable. I think it's harder at the federal level, but I do think it's an opportunity at the local level. And I think that I believe this crisis is going to be long-term. I see things that show it's going to be pretty long-term. And I think that also is an opportunity to move more and more people, that this isn't just going to end in the next 2 months, 3 months, but I think 18 months. And so this is an extended crisis. And that we'll continue to see people in leadership continue to fumble over it because they have no idea how to actually fix the things going on, and more people being agitated, which creates its own risks, but also creates real opportunity for organizing and power.
I think that, oh, sorry. You can go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jessica.
Okay. No, I was just going to say that I think part of the pain that people are going through right now is the fact that they feel disempowered, right? You can't do anything. Like all these things are being decided for you. You got fired. It's not a decision you made. You can't pay rent. That's not a decision you made. You can't feed your family. Like all of these things leave somebody feeling very disempowered. And that's just an opportunity for us to be able to engage those folks, right? And equip them and empower them to be able to like agitate. And I think one of the things we would do at our campaign headquarters office before we went out there to, you know, talk to people, or before we started phone banking, whenever volunteers were around, we would ask each other, why are you here? And I wish y'all could hear like the amount of stories that had so many painful anecdotes. And that's the reason why people decided to get involved, because they didn't want to see that happen again to themselves or their families or people that they know. And I think this is going to be one of those moments that people are going to turn back and look at what happened during the pandemic. And I think we should, you know, use that as an opportunity and start setting in that infrastructure. And one of the beautiful things about this being unprecedented times is that nobody knows how to organize right now. So why not be creative about it and have fun and try to figure out a way to connect with folks right now?
Yeah, I usually don't make a habit of repeating the same point that other panelists have made, but like high five, high five, high five, plus one, plus one, plus one. Absolutely. This is the moment. This isn't an academic debate, right? People are losing their lives, right? People are losing their livelihoods. And so we've been screaming from the mountaintops about how these policies will kill us. And now we are watching corporations, the airlines, cruise companies leverage this moment to like line their pockets. And meanwhile, again, 80% of the people that have been hospitalized in our state are Black. Meanwhile, we've been saying forever that if one of us isn't insured, none of us are insured. We're learning each and every day about how the virus is spread. I'm getting questions. There's new medical research out today that shows that if you pass gas, like literally farts can pass along coronavirus. Like, we're not safe. And our state has been open for 21 days, right? And so while other people are having debates about the state, that we've been open for 3 weeks. I read an article in the Washington Post over the weekend because, tons of reporters are now interested in what's happening in Georgia. Like, how quickly are these people gonna die? And as a model or like as an exemplar to try to understand how other states should maneuver. And they, interviewed some diners who were, brunching on the patio and asked, why were they so confident? Why were they having a good time? They're like, well, we looked at the data and it wasn't us that was at risk. So we thought it was cool to come in and have brunch with my boys. So basically saying, I'm not Black, I'm not poor, I'm not old, I am not sick or compromised in any other way. So fuck it. And that is the attitude of many people who are currently developing policy for us and running our politics. So like, this is absolutely the moment. And to Jessica's point, no one knows how to organize in this moment. Some staff and some community members ran an action on me because so many people by now know about the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, young man jogging in South Georgia. And, prior to coronavirus, like, of course, protesting and demonstrations would have been a part of the tactics to sort of put pressure on the local elected officials to, bring these folks to trial, et cetera. They asked to join a caravan to drive down to Brunswick, Georgia, to participate in a protest. And I didn't say no, but what I said was that this is not sanctioned by the organization. And frankly, I don't agree with it. I think that this moment is asking of us to dig deeper, to think about ways that we continue to sort of build power, we continue to organize ourselves, we continue to organize resources, but we don't have to lean on the tactics that we've used in the past. Like, in some ways, the fear, the scariness of this moment is kind of freeing. So we get to focus on like what will actually work, what will actually bring about the change that we seek. What are our actual demands, as opposed to going into our traditional organizer protest bag.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think where multiple people are landing is that there's incredible opportunity, there's incredible risk, and the opportunities that are there are ones that we may not be prepared to fully take advantage of. There's a whole bunch of sort of defensive fights that we need to be in, and there's a way that we can consolidate our wins and build off of them. Think about sort of building a broader coalition for the future, and sort of understand what are the places where we can be most successful. And Jessica, I want to bring you back in because one of the things that's changed this year, aside from everything connected to the COVID crisis, is that without a progressive candidate now at the top of the ticket, many groups have sort of refocused their efforts on down ballot races, which we think that people should have been focused on anyway. But can you talk about how the loss of a true progressive, left progressive at the top of the ticket impacts down ballot races and groups trying to elect progressives for how groups trying to elect progressives further down the ballot should shift their approach, if at all, in this moment? If you'd been your party's nominee right now in the district that you were running in, how would you have approached this moment in your district?
It's interesting because I think you really need to trust the instincts of the organizers that are from that area. Because if somebody here from South Texas is more concerned about local elections than they are up at the top of the ticket. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the opposite in other areas, right? Where it's like it's the top of the ticket that like it motivates people to go out and vote. But like if you were to look into Zapata County, and the reason why they had such a high turnout was because of a local sheriff's race. And there's specific, in every county there was something local that was happening that was pushing people to the polls. And I think that, for us, it wouldn't, at least here, I don't think it would have changed it that much because, and again, this comes back to like this whole swath of people not knowing what's happening at the national level. And I use my parents all the time as like an example and like a sounding board of like average Laredoans, average people in our district, because if I were to tell them like, oh, hey, I got an interview with the New York Times, I came out on this and I came out on that, I was interviewed for this, they'd be like, oh, that's great. But they had no concept about it. Like the New York Times we went to like gas stations around here and we couldn't find it. We had to go to San Antonio to get it. And it means nothing to people, right? But if I were to say like, hey, I got interviewed by the local news station, it was like a big deal, right? So knowing those things, I think is really important in terms of like how you're developing your strategies, and that it's not a cookie cutter thing. Something that works here in South Texas is not going to work elsewhere. And again, like for me, it just comes back on who you have on your team and, what the strategies are going to be and if it's going to be tailored to the area. Here, relational organizing was huge. When we went out there and we're knocking on doors, you didn't know what the impact of that door knock would have because you might have spoken to one person, but the family, the cousins, the primos, tías, tíos, abuelitos and abuelitas, like they heard about your visit to go knock on the door because it's something super unusual and doesn't happen often here. So those were the things that we knew were working for us. And I think they would have worked regardless of who was, at the top of the ticket. But again, I think that's, I don't want to speak for other areas because, I don't know how it impacts in other areas. I can only speak for what happened and would happen here based on my instincts and my experience. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it does feel like there are whole different sections of the population that are kind of more and more ready to go to elect someone new, to take action, to do something different, to fight. Whether it's your folks in South Texas, whether it's the Georgia Project and folks that are organizing. I wanted to ask Harmony, you write about this bigger we, something that needs to be created in this moment, kind of patching together many of the sections of society that are struggling and or that want change. Do you see that coming together? Is there a strategy to sew together a bigger we? And do you think that that opportunity is here, or do you think kind of folks are too divided at this moment?
I think this is absolutely the moment to build a bigger we. We've never seen a clearer time where working people across, like from incredibly poor, unemployed, super exploited people, well up into the upper middle class, are both struggling financially and living in fear of their lives and having a shared experience of that. I think it's an actually important example because we all know the incredibly painful stories of the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black and Latino communities, whether it's because of environmental racism and pollution that lay the groundwork for respiratory conditions that make people more susceptible to death, whether it's immigrant workers being sent back to work by President Trump to the meatpacking warehouses, the meatpacking factories where the disease is spreading like wildfire, right? Whether it's the healthcare not being easily accessible in low-income communities and communities of color, we all see the disproportionate impact on Black and Latino communities, and thankfully it's finally getting some attention in the public. And at the same time, this is a pandemic that has been spreading at rates that it never should have, in ways that are affecting huge proportions of the population across race and class, and particularly older folks and people with pre-existing conditions, because the corporate agenda has decimated the social welfare state so much, using racism, right, driven by racism and using racism, they have torn apart the safety net that could have protected all of us. And so there's never been in my lifetime a moment when it is so clear that we have shared interests. And we use this phrase, building a bigger we, to help try to articulate the idea that we're often pushed into a false dichotomy. The left tends to think in false binary terms, that either we can speak to the particular needs of the most impacted communities, or we can try to lead society as a whole and just pretend that all those differences don't exist, right? And we think that that is a false decision. That is a false decision, right? We can actually put the interests and the struggles of the most impacted people at the front and center of a broader social movement and speak to the issues of those communities, but speak in ways that actually speak across society as a whole in a much more expansive way, not in a way that narrows our social base, that narrows our analysis, and frankly, that closes our hearts to all the people of this country who are struggling, but puts those communities in leadership, right? And that's difficult. It's not easy. And it actually asks a whole lot of the most impacted communities to step into that kind of stance, right? But it's a winning stance. And the question that we keep running into is the question of power, right? And we need to build a huge level of power to actually change things in this society. And that means we actually need to speak to the interests of broad cross sections of society. And if we dig into it, we don't do that by silencing the most impacted communities. We do that by articulating the needs of most impacted communities in ways that can speak across the spectrum, right? And I think we do see that coming together in the demands for relief. Again, the coronavirus is creating the openings that make lots of shifts in our work possible. And we do see an articulation, for example, of clarity about like the need for support around housing that speaks not just to renters, but speaks to renters and homeowners, right? Rent cancellation and mortgage relief are being articulated together as like we all need our homes to be guaranteed, right? And that's the kind of, I think there's different places where that's emerging. And unfortunately, partly it's going to continue to emerge because larger, for the next period at least, large cross sections of people are going to be driven down the economic ladder in the next period. So it requires us to adopt this stance of a bigger we, a more expansive we, but not a we that silences our differences, but a we that articulates them together.
I'm not sure, and say if you're trying to get in there, but I kind of want to ask you to expand or react and kind of bring your own thinking to like what is possible in terms of a broad coalition right now, especially on the electoral front. I feel like what Harmony's saying is really compelling, and then I kind of think of the presidential race and the fact that the candidate heading up our party doesn't represent that vision that she's laying out. At the same time, is there an opportunity for kind of broad sections of society to come together in this moment, to get rid of Trump, to do some of this work that needs to get done? I don't think everybody is super excited to get on like the Biden dialer if he has one, but maybe there's other ways we can bring this together. So just wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, my head absolutely agrees with the bigger we and my heart, but it is labor, and it is, and I appreciate Harmony's framing the idea that it in some ways asks a lot of folks who are the most impacted. I think that, as we are talking and sort of doing our civics training, I am reminded of Obama's presidency, when there were demands for, police accountability, et cetera, or demands for policy or a politic that centered Black folks, poor people, Southerners, the most marginalized. The refrain is often, I'm going to be the president for all of America. I'm governing for all of Georgia, et cetera. And so I think that that challenges me as an individual, as a person who sort of has multiple identities that often feel under attack. One, two, I think the thing that I'm also challenged by is that Black voters delivered Biden his victory. And so while I, am challenged by that, I also, believe in self-determination. I believe in listening to the communities that I organize in. And so, I do not want to substitute my analysis for the analysis that someone else has made, in making a choice for themselves in the primary or in anything related to politics or civic engagement. And so I think that as we talk or plan or organize around the bigger we, it is really, really important for us to understand what is it in Biden that Black voters saw in South Carolina and other primary states that led them to pull the lever for him. And I don't know if we have brought that analysis into our planning for the fall, and we meaning like a broader left. And I think that that's super important when we think about who the base of the Democratic Party is, and when we think about what that multiracial coalition is going to need to look like in order for us to win. Again, the organizers on my staff also marched on me about this very same issue. I mean, we haven't made an endorsement yet, and we are, trying to stay alive. And so presidential politics and the primary, that's June 9th, is not necessarily at the top of our sort of public facing list, but internally we are having these very like charged, passionate conversations about what it means to knock on, well, maybe not knock on doors, what it means to text people and try to move people to vote for Biden. And there was a line that an organizer who was not necessarily pro-Biden, but was sort of, as we were circling the drain and like trying to resolve the conversation, she said, "I'd rather drink spoiled milk than arsenic." And when we are thinking, when we're having real talk about what our options are, you have Trump and you have Biden in terms of when you're thinking about the top of the ticket. And so not drinking something for us is not an option, right? And so if you're dying of thirst and you have spoiled milk and you have arsenic, these feel like our choices, and that's not very glamorous. And like, I hope that this doesn't like come back to bite me in the ass at some point. But that's the level of conversation that we're having. I think that we don't have enough curiosity about the intentions and the motivations of Black voters. I think that we should not dismiss again, when we think about what the most significant, the largest, most loyal part of the Democratic base, that we need to do more to interrogate. We need to do more to understand what the motivations are, what the priorities are, and how we need to talk to them. I do feel like, you know, as a supporter of Sanders and supporter of the platform, that was a very real critique that I felt, that I sat through, that I experienced directly from the mouths of like these Black women, these you know, ladies in church who run Souls to the Polls and are personally responsible for bringing hundreds of people to the and, you know, so I need to know and understand what they see and what they're looking for in the choice of a presidential candidate. And again, what their priorities are. And not only I, like as a person who runs a sort of movement organization, but these candidates, if you're serious about winning.
Mm-hmm. That's great, Nsé. Yeah, I want to come over to Robert because I think and say you sort of put the question in very stark terms: spoiled milk or arsenic, right? And we organizers have a lot of strategic decisions to make, but we don't choose the conditions under which we have to make strategy always. And Robert, I'm wondering if you can help us make sense of the spoiled milk option of the Democratic Party as a terrain of struggle to build this bigger we that we've been talking about. Some organizers view the party as a class enemy, that at most provides a ballot line to run on and nothing more. Others view the party as sort of a completely open, blank slate, as sort of instrument that could be won over and then used to movement ends. What strategic opportunities are there for organizers inside of the party? What is the struggle for the Democratic Party look like in real life? What are the sort of most the best opportunities we have to make impact there?
Yeah, I'll just say, I think if you're serious about organizing Black folks, it's the Democratic Party, and that needs to be a real conversation with people. And I think the other part about this is that the party is somewhat of an amorphous blob, in my opinion. And, of course, it gets it's tougher to say this now as the Republicans are becoming even more and more reactionary and to the right. But I mean, I think, wow, this is like a huge question. I think the idea is like to look at the party as an apparatus and to organize in that apparatus, both in the short term and the long term. And the Democratic Party almost for presidential nominated a Democratic socialist twice, which I think people need to sit back and think that's wild in 4 years. The fact that I sometimes laugh that I am in this seat, and not to talk about myself, but I got appointed first through the chair of the Democratic Party. And I'm pretty openly left in a very unique, extremely diverse politically and economically and racially seat. And it, I sometimes, again, it led to a little bit of the imposter syndrome, but I think it tells us about the opportunities that we can have if we organize enough power. This party is an apparatus for us to build into. I don't think we don't have parties like other countries do, where we have a formal membership, which is, both has its upsides and its downsides. But in one place, it means is that you can come in there when it is at a weak point and not sure what to do in a crisis, when it's vulnerable. And there are many parts of the Democratic Party that are vulnerable. And if you have enough power, you will have a space in there, and you will have a space in there to build. Now, of course, when that makes it a little bit more complicated sometimes when you're governing, but I think, especially right now where the Republican Party is like hurtling towards fascism, I think that, the Democratic Party is a mess, and it can be a shit place to be in. But it is the place I think we need to be in. And I think that particularly if you're trying to organize a multi-generational movement, it is important that how we communicate and talk about the Democratic Party, and in some of those spaces, we have to be very aware of the history and the relationship that truly does exist. And you know what? I think about the Sanders campaign. In my campaign, I decided to pull the presidential, and there was a real opportunity for him to do very well with Black voters in the 13th district. And I saw it. I talked to many folks about it, and it was clear that messaging might not have gotten to folks higher up. I don't know, but I was just like, here's a poll. Here's what I see. There's Biden's strength is basically on, the idea that he can beat Trump. And here's an idea of messaging. Here's a way to communicate. Here's some of the political stuff that needs to happen. And I think that's something to learn from for all of us as we try to build beyond just state Senate, aldermanic, or city council, or smaller races on a federal level. But I do think the Democratic Party is it really has an opportunity for us to step right in, and it's going to take a long time. I don't think it happens just with the snap of the fingers, but I always think of this as when I'm 65, what is the party then? And what have we done to organize, and how much power have we built? And that to me is sort of the vision I hold, and I think a lot of people I organize with. I think that made sense, and I hope everybody who's listening was like, this state senator is semi-coherent. But yes.
Thank you, Robert. It was more than semi-coherent.
Springfield. I just want to point out, I'm in Springfield. I've been up since 6 o'clock. I'm like social distance voting, and I wrote poetry when I was 18, and you can hold that over me, but this happens. So
well, thank you, Robert, and all of you for making the sacrifice to show up tonight. I think we'll use Robert's really provocative points here to close out. But this was, again, just an amazingly rich discussion. If people have not already taken the opportunity to follow and check out all of the 4 speakers that we've had tonight and their organizations, please do that. Also, please drop a like on Organizing Upgrade on Facebook. Visit organizingupgrade.com for a bunch more great content, and therealnews.com to check out our tech partner that's also producing a bunch of great content every day. And look, folks have actually raised some really stark questions around the Bernie campaign, which is a great lead-in to the sorts of things that we're going to be asking 2 of the smartest organizers in the country that come out of the Bernie campaign, senior staffers out of the Bernie campaign, 3 weeks from tonight on June 10th at 8 p.m. Eastern. So thanks to everyone for joining us. Adam, you want to take us out?
Just another special thanks to our guests. I really want to thank you for stepping out and saying things that may or may not try to bite you in the ass. I just want to promise that we will have your back if any of that happens. Just call us. We'll be there. We'll defend you. Really appreciate you try and set up an honest show, and appreciate you bringing that. So everyone, thanks for joining us tonight, and keep fighting. Talk to you next time.